Welcome to Humble Beginnings, a podcast where we uncover the unconventional, more relatable paths to success. In this show, we'll share the stories before the C-suites, board memberships, and appointments, the stories of various upbringings, first jobs, career pivots, educational uncertainties, and more. This is the place to hear about their lives from the GovCon executives themselves. We hope you enjoy. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Humble Beginnings. I'm your host, Amanda Ziede, and joining me today is Ed Swallow, who is Senior Vice President, Chief Operating Officer, Chief Financial Officer, and Treasurer of the Aerospace Corporation. Thank you for being here today, Ed, and for sharing your story with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome, me too. So we're going to start from the beginning, as we typically do on this show. Tell me a bit about your upbringing in White Plains, New York.
So started out, actually, my dad was working for a construction company. And so the first 3 years of my life, I lived in Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Manhattan. When my mother became pregnant with my sister, my mother said, okay, now you're commuting and I'm staying in one place, because we were following his construction jobs. We moved to White Plains. About that same time, my grandfather started a construction company. So my dad left Aristides grocery stores for anybody that's from the New York area and went to work for my grandfather.
All right. I understand there were also some pivotal moments during this time, during your upbringing, that impacted you later on. So can you share those with us and how they affected you?
Oh, absolutely. So I mentioned the construction company. So my grandfather had a pretty successful construction company all through the 60s. Unfortunately, he passed away. My dad took over the construction company. But then when I was about 12 years old in the late 60s, my parents got divorced. And not long after that, the 72, 73 oil shock, my father's construction company, now my former grandfather's, declared bankruptcy. And as part of that, my father declared personal bankruptcy. So that kind of shaped a lot of my worldview at that time and really brought home the need for being a little more self-sufficient. And I think that was a real pivotal moment, as I'm getting into my 14 and 15 years old.
And to my understanding, this is kind of when you got your first job, or jobs, plural.
Yeah, so in New York, you could work 20 hours during the school year per week once you turn 15. So literally the weekend after I turned 15, I walked into a newly opened pizzeria restaurant and said, hey, do you guys need help? And they said, yes. And I said, when do I start? And they said, go put one of the shirts on in the back. You start now. So it was $2 an hour after, take home after tax, and working from 3:30 to 7:30, 5 days a week. And at the same time, my stepfather owned a roofing company, but was also a roofer. So I'd spend my Saturdays working on the roof, and I'd spend Monday through Friday working at a pizzeria. So I was doing that all through middle school, when I finished middle school, and all through high school. There were times when things got a little interesting in the pizza business in the New York area. So I ended up working in a gas station for part of that time. And I kind of bounced between the gas station and the pizzeria, depending on what time of year it was and who was busy and who wasn't. Pretty much through high school, and even when I was in college, I flipped pies. And when I was in Syracuse, I delivered pizzas. And my last year in Syracuse, we had 33 feet of snow, and I was in charge of delivering pizza. So the bad news was it was a rear wheel drive station wagon.
Wow.
So I learned how to drive in snow and ice really well. Studded snow tires, 200 pounds of sand in the back. Everything worked fine. But the tips were wonderful. So, convenience is good. But the combination of working in a pizzeria, working in a gas station, learning how to get things done, how to fix things, I think has always shaped my thinking about there's always a way to get something done. But working in the roofing business more than anything else really taught me you can make more money with your brain than you can with your back. The guy who cuts the deal, the person who actually sells the roof and who makes the profit after everybody else puts in their work, that's where the real money was made in the roofing business, not in the lugging the 100 pounds of slate up on your shoulder, up a 30-foot ladder, hammering it in, taking broken slate, putting it in a bucket and carrying it back down. While that did wonders for my muscle tone, it did not do wonders for my bank account. And so that's one of those cases where, a fundamental lesson of making more money with your brain than your back really hit home. And that's what drove me to go to college.
Awesome. Yeah. And talking about being resourceful and coming up with, like you said, there's always a way to do something. You have one of the most unconventional ways of financing your college education that I've heard recently. So tell us about your emancipation, how you came to this idea and how it worked for you.
Oh, so when I was headed to college, I said, I knew that with a father that had recently declared bankruptcy, a stepfather running a roofing company, and both my mother and father had remarried. So I was actually going to be looking at four people's income on the qualification statement, to get what are now called Pell Grants, but back then it was Basic Educational Opportunity Grant and Supplemental Education Opportunity Grant. And so as a result of that, I had four incomes, yet nobody was making enough money to actually be able to contribute to my college education. And so somebody that I was friends with, my middle school principal, a member of the church that I went to, said, you ought to look at emancipation. If you declare emancipation in the state of New York, where you're emancipated from your parents, you're filing your own tax returns is the primary requirement, but you're certifying that you are providing the predominance of your support, which I was going to be when I went to college. By doing that, I now only had my income and my 1040 form with the IRS in order to qualify for the grant. So that gave me a significant advantage in being able to get those grants and the very few student loans that I got. But it also enabled me to get student work study program, which was actually a phenomenal program. And then also for financing school, I made pizzas in the student union. And I did that during dinner hour. And then on Friday and Saturday night, I went downstairs to the Rathskeller. Drinking age was 18. This was okay on campus. It went down and, what do you do when you drink beer? You eat pizza. So I made more pizza down in the Rathskeller in the basement on campus Friday and Saturday nights. And between that, living off campus and actually still doing roofing, I ended up pretty much every physics professor and chemistry professor that owned a house in Oneonta ended up getting their roof redone the summer of 1978 or the summer of 1977 when I was there. I was a pretty good salesman when it came to buying discount roofing products.
That's awesome. Like you said, there's a way, you can always find a way to do something. You're very resourceful, and that's really interesting. So this was during your time at the SUNY University, correct? You were studying physics.
Yep. I actually went into what's called the 3-2 engineering program. So you spend 3 years at a SUNY school getting a BA or a BS in a science program, and then you would go to another school for 2 years to get your engineering degree. I minored in astronomy and also took secondary education classes. This is kind of how I got interested in STEM education even back then. I had interest in being a high school physics teacher, but I really had a drive to be an engineer. So I went into the 3-2 engineering program, knowing that I was going to have to go find scholarships to be able to go get the engineering degree.
And then you did so at Syracuse. So tell
Yep.
us about that continuation.
So it was one of those cases where I said, okay, I'm looking for a pretty big scholarship. I want to go to a good school. So I applied to both Navy and Air Force ROTC. So Navy offered me a scholarship to go to SUNY Buffalo, but I was going to be a nuclear propulsion officer. And that kind of sounded, okay, submarines underwater, taking care of the engine. Air Force said full ride, Syracuse University, electrical engineering. And I said, yeah, that one. And so off I went to Syracuse on a full ride. They paid tuition, books, lab fees, incidental fees, and $200 a month. So you take that $200 a month plus what I could earn at a pizzeria of all places, delivering pizza, enabled me to make it through school. So I ended up 5 years of college, 2 degrees, minor in math from Syracuse, minor in astronomy from Oneonta. So 2 majors, 2 minors, and a little less than $3,500 in total debt.
Wow. And before we get to the next part of your life, the career part, reflecting on making these decisions for yourself, working essentially since you were 14, 15 years old, what did that teach you? How did that change your perspective in life, the way you can kind of look back at it now?
There were times both in Oneonta and in Syracuse where, so I wanted to live off campus, so I arranged to get everybody to live in the same house with me. But I was the one that actually signed the rental document, and so I was on the hook for all the rent. But I also arranged things like I would do all the grocery shopping for everybody because, in fact, I worked at a pizzeria which could get, wholesale prices for a
Mhm.
lot of food. Plus, I could bring mistake pizzas home on a regular basis, which was a great way of feeding people at very low cost. So I actually had an arrangement. Everybody put money into the kitty on a weekly basis. I did the grocery shopping, but I was able to actually then help pay for my food. And through bringing pizzas home and all that kind of stuff, people wanted to be in the house. They were willing to pay a little extra for rent. So everybody paid a little more for rent. So I paid a little bit less.
Nice.
That's called the vigorish
Hmm.
in certain terms. But it was really a matter of, it was the beginning of my entrepreneurial spirit. It was really figuring out that, I may want to be an engineer, but business is important too. Understanding what the difference between cost and value. So the food would cost a certain amount of money, but it had a value to my roommates. So I could charge more on the value, save money on the cost, and pocket the difference in terms of the food I consumed. So it was really a fundamental teaching opportunity. Now, at the same time, there were times where people didn't pay their rent on time, but it was my credit rating that was at risk because I was the one that signed it. So I always made sure the rent got paid. And there were some times that the number of digits in the bank account and the number of digits needed to make the rent payment didn't always line up. So that was a very important lesson about making sure to pay yourself. An important lesson that I learned very early on, and it was I was in the Air Force for 5 years. I went to work at a CETA contractor after being there for 5 years, and the guy that recruited me over there when I first got there, I didn't know what a 401k was, but we had a 401k, and he said the first thing you want to do is make sure you don't leave any money on the table with the match. But one of the things my mother had taught me from the very beginning was half of every paycheck goes in the bank. So starting from when I was 5 or 6 years old, if we got money for a holiday, we got money for a birthday, half of it went into my mother's purse and then went into our savings account. That's part of why I had money to go to college because my mother enforced that. But the exact same thing was communicated to me by this mentor that I had at a company called Ultra Systems, which was every time you get a raise, half of the raise goes into the 401k until you max out. Pay yourself first. And that was a fundamental principle that my mom instilled in me, but I applied it in real life lesson after I graduated. And that's something that I pass along to a lot of our early career employees, both when I was at Northrop and here, is pay yourself first. Don't leave any money on the table. If they're matching it, you're putting it in. Figure out how to live without it. But also, you've already figured out how to live without that raise. So make half of that raise work for you and then let the other half do something for you right away. But make that long-term commitment. If you max out on your 401k starting in your early 20s, you're in great shape when it comes time to retire. An average person, if you max out and you put it into an S&P 500 or some kind of a balanced fund, you will have over $1 million when it's time to retire. Just mathematically speaking, you work for 40 years, you put 25,000 a year, that's $1 million without any increase. You could have $1.5 million or 2 million over that period of time just by that one simple trick. So it started when I was very young. Half of everything goes in the bank, half of every raise goes into making a savings commitment to helping you achieve your long-term life goals.
Awesome. And these are the things we should be teaching our kids in school instead of just kidding. Taxes, 401ks. No, these are very helpful and responsible life tips.
Yeah, it's amazing to me that a lot of the schools do not have the kinds of classes that, when I went to school in White Plains, New York in high school, they had a class that we had to take when we were seniors that was I don't remember what it was called, but it was basically life skills. It was how to balance a checkbook. And back then you had a per check fee. So it wasn't just subtract off the amount of the check, but you also had to figure out there was a 6 cent charge that went with every check. So that had to be deducted because if you wrote a lot of checks, you had to do it. This is before ATMs and all that. I'm really dating myself here. But you learned how to balance a checkbook. You learned how to do tax returns. Now, I had already had to figure out how to do that, especially in preparation for emancipation. But I was earning money. I was getting a W-2. I had to do something with that W-2.
Yeah. And with your mentality and your approach to these jobs you had during college and then your career after college, it's no surprise that you're successful, but take us through your professional journey and how you got to where you are today.
Well, so yeah, I told you I went to work for Ultra Systems when I got out of the Air Force. So first of all, 5 years in the Air Force, flying low altitude satellite programs. I was the last uniform targeting officer, and I can say this out loud now, for the Gambit and Hexagon film return satellite reconnaissance systems. So I was responsible for helping to put together the command deck that went up to the satellite that told it what pictures to take as it was flying through the sky. I went up to Thule, Greenland as deputy commander of the tracking station up there. Taught me a tremendous amount about leading people under pressure. There was one incident when I was up there. We sent a crew out for a shift change from the main base out to the tracking station, which was about 4 miles off the end of the runway. The wind was blowing at about 40 knots when we first sent the bus out, but it rapidly increased to over 100 miles an hour. So it was well over hurricane force. Complete whiteout. It was in the winter, so it was 100% dark. This is north of the Arctic Circle. There was no sun coming up for at least a month and a half. Not a couple of hours, a month and a half before the sun would come up. So we had to mount a rescue to get them back because the wind started blowing that we didn't expect, and it looked like it was going to be blowing for a long time. I learned a lot about leading people under pressure during that incident. I also learned about the consequences of making decisions, about sending a crew out when you didn't know what the weather was, when you didn't have complete situational understanding. And so I made sure never to make that mistake again. Always ask an extra question or two to understand the context. But when I got to Ultra Systems, it was interesting because while I wanted to do engineering and I was brought in as an individual contributor to support a major development program as a CETA contractor, I also had a lot of interest in leading people. So I went from individual contributor to task manager to assistant program manager to deputy program manager to program manager to manager, director of programs for the Northern California office in 6 years. So 6 jobs, 6 years. And it was all a matter of, first of all, I helped grow the organization tremendously because every time a customer said, I need, I want, I have a problem, it was, let me see what I can do to satisfy the need, satiate the want, or solve the problem. And so they were willing to bring extra people onto the team. So I was growing the business. And so the company said, well, if he's growing the business, let him run it. And I wanted to manage people and other people didn't. So it was kind of like, if you remember the old TV commercial, let Mikey do it, he'll eat anything. It was like, let Ed do it, he'll manage anything. So that's how I ended up in management and leadership positions. And so it was really kind of a head start for me. I left there, went to a small business called Space Applications Corporation as a tech director, again, individual contributor, moved almost immediately into deputy program manager, and then division general manager. Then they moved me to the East Coast. But when they moved me to the East Coast, they asked me to take on business development. And that was my first foray into business development from a line position. And I discovered, much to my chagrin, that I was actually good at business development. So there's a really good book I recommend people read called Overcoming Your Strengths. I wish I had read it back then so that I could have gotten back into line management a lot faster.
So how did you get to wearing so many different hats at the Aerospace Corporation?
So when I was at Space Applications Corporation, we got bought by a company that was publicly traded, Stephen Myers and Associates, SM&A. We bought 3 other companies. We assembled those companies into a couple of other different companies and then sold them off. So by 2001, the part of the company that I was with got sold to L3. We closed 3 weeks after 9/11. And so there was an opportunity for me to go work for L3 at headquarters to work in the mergers and acquisitions group. And But that would have been right in downtown New York, 3 blocks from ground zero. And my wife said, you want to move us where to do what? You're going to be on the road all the time, and I'm going to live in downtown New York. This says the person born and raised in California. And she said, yeah, no. So I ended up going to work for probably the greatest mentor in my entire career. And his name was Jim Lindenfelser. He was at Task. They recruited me over to go to work at Task, went to work for Jim, and had an absolutely phenomenal time. I worked for him for 4 years as his deputy. We doubled the business in 4 years.
Wow. That's
So
impressive.
we had just a tremendous one. We were about 165 million when I got there. And when he retired in 2005, we were 350 million, and more than double the number of people that were there. He was a great mentor, a great leader, and I learned a tremendous amount from him. What's interesting is there were 16 people, either direct reports or one level down from him, that were part of that leadership team. Every single one of those people made it to be a vice president, president, or CEO of a GovCon somewhere in the DC metro area. He was just a tremendous leader. He attracted leaders to him and just made a tremendous difference.
That's awesome. And wasn't there something that you had mentioned he particularly taught you?
Well, so a couple of things. First of all, if you're at the head of the class, you're in the wrong class. Number two, surround yourself with people that are smarter than you. You can learn a lot from others. And number three, and this was the most important one, if you pay attention to helping your people achieve their career objectives and help them achieve their highest goals, they will move mountains to help make the entire team successful. And so by him investing in all of those leaders and helping them understand how to be leaders, he invested in a tremendous number of careers, but he himself, as a result, was tremendously successful as part of that.
And if I also remember correctly, when we were talking before, you had mentioned there was only one job that you actually had to apply for in your career.
Yes. And that was when I got out of the Air Force. I applied, I was recruited for Ultra Systems, but I actually applied for a bunch of other jobs. And I actually applied for the Ultra Systems job, although they had said, hey, we really want you to come to work here. But that was the one and only time I actually had to put resumes together and cover letters and send them out and do all that kind of stuff. Every other job after that was somebody reaching out and saying, hey, here's a great thing for you to go do. And wouldn't you like to go do this? And so in 1987, I was at Ultra Systems had gotten bought by Logicon at that time. And Logicon, when you moved into an executive position, so when I became program manager, they assigned me a career coach. So the guy had me do all the tests, the Myers-Briggs, the team management index, the fill in the blank kind of thing, and came back and said, here are the things that these assessments say you're really interested in. And here are the things that you're not interested in. So here's the things that will make you happy in a job. And here are the things that will make you a little bit less happy. But he helped me put an algorithm together to help me decide whether I wanted to go after an opportunity or not. And I developed that in 1987, and it has never changed all the way through to today. And that's rule number one is it has to be fun and interesting and learn something new every day. Rule number two is I have to be able to make a difference and be respected for making that difference. And rule number three, I'm going to quote the name of a book. It's called the No Asshole Rule. But I will change that to I have to like the people I'm working with. Now, I will take a rule 3 violation if rule 1 is strong enough. And there were times early in my career that I went to work for people I knew were difficult, but I knew I could learn from them. And even throughout my career, I was willing to go to work for some of the more difficult people if I was going to learn from them. That goes back to when I first went to work in that pizzeria. There was one of the brothers that owned that place that I really liked, and there was one of those brothers that 100 decibels was whisper. He was just, everything you did was wrong. You were stupid. You were an idiot. He used a lot of other words in Italian that I can't repeat anyplace. You'd have to bleep the entire conversation out. So I learned the difference between a good manager and a really annoying one. And so that vision always came back in my head every time when you go into an interview and they always say, do you have any questions? My answer is always, yes, I've got several of them. And one of them is, how do you define success 1 year after I take this job? How will you tell me that I've been successful? What is it that I need to do to be successful? Number two, Tell me about a recent time where somebody did not meet your expectation and how did you deal with it? Because I want to know how they're dealing with it, how they're doing that, and all that. I want to hear whether, I yelled at them, I sat them down, I reminded them of this. I want to hear how they deal with people that are not meeting expectations. And I will also always ask them, which would you rather have working for you? A competent but not very friendly person, or one of your friends that's not that skilled? You can get a lot out of the answer to that question. First of all, they usually stammer. It's kind of like, I've never been asked that question. There's another question that I use a lot when I'm interviewing people now, that I actually got when I was interviewing for the job of being the deputy commander at Thule. So I was still in the Air Force at the time. Tell me about an assumption people make about you that's not true, and how do you deal with it?
That's a good one.
So it's really a good way of determining how self-aware somebody is about themselves.
Totally.
So that's another one that I'll ask prospective bosses along the way. So it's one of those cases I learned it the hard way in my very first job out, not working for my stepfather or my father. I learned it the hard way with, it was all, is Sal working today or is Tony working today? Literally, those were their names, Sal and Tony. You cannot make this up.
So New York.
Italian pizzeria in White Plains, New York. They had a second store that was down in Queens. So one of them would run the Queens store, the other one would come up to White Plains. So is Sal or Tony working tomorrow? Because there were times that I was walking there from school and it was kind of like, oh, Sal's working today.
Hopefully Sal isn't listening to this episode, but
Well, given that they were 30 years older than me, something tells me at 96, they probably don't remember me anymore.
Oh, I'm sure you left a mark. Well, Ed, I know that you've been extremely resourceful throughout your life and you've made things happen for yourself. I know you've had some mentors along the way as well, and you give that back now. I know mentorship is an important part of your day-to-day. So talk to us a bit about that.
Well, so part of that is why I came to work here at Aerospace. So I had retired from the Air Force. I stayed in the reserves, or retired from the reserves in the early 2000s. I was at Northrop Grumman, became an officer at Northrop Grumman, retired as an officer in 2014. And I was just going to do consulting and I was going to do that kind of stuff. And a guy that I greatly respected that had a job here at Aerospace had retired about 3 years earlier. And his replacement had then been in the job for a while, and his replacement was now moving back to the West Coast. And he called me up and he said, I've got an opportunity for you, not a job, an opportunity. I have a group of people that you can mentor and help them do a much better job in the space program. And I said, okay, you have my attention, because I'd been in the space business for many, many years. And he said, come to work for Aerospace, run the civil and commercial group, and come mentor these people, help them learn how to be better business people. They work for a nonprofit. They don't really understand the business side of things. So I came to work here mainly as a mentoring opportunity. So that's how I got started within the company. Now, it was a vice president job. I was running civil and commercial operations. It was one of the 4 customer-facing groups. Again, I grew that business in 6 years. I about doubled it in about 6 years, but I created a tremendous set of people. I applied the lessons that I learned from Jim Lindenfelser and how to develop leaders. So right now, the chief technology officer was one of the people that was a director, an early career director under me there. So she's now the chief technology officer for the corporation. Several other people have moved into very senior roles throughout the company. But it was mentoring those people that really brought me back out of 2 retirements. By the way, I suck at retirement, really bad at it. And so, I partnered with WashingtonExec, putting in a plug here, partnered with WashingtonExec and spent a lot of time helping to chair the committee that put on the STEM conferences every year, and giving back to the entire community. Northrop Grumman was the first sponsor of that when I was at Northrop Grumman. Aerospace was a sponsor a little bit later when I came to work here. So we've been very involved in all of that. But it's also very important for us to really engage with students. So it's been very important. One of the initiatives within aerospace right now is called Space Workforce 2030. It was something that we got started, but we now have 31 companies in the space business who have signed on. And so swf2030.org is a webpage that talks about a pledge that the CEOs of those 31 companies made to increase the diversity of the space workforce by 2030. Aerospace, as a trusted agent within the aerospace and defense marketplace as an FFRDC, collects all the diversity data from all of the companies, and we report on an annual basis. This year at the Space Symposium, we came up with our very first report. Great progress has been made. We're working our way towards next year, but at the same time, we've also started a space interns program. One application. So any of the students that are out there that are looking for internships in the space business, one place, you apply once, you're considered by all 31 companies.
Wow.
So it's a tremendous opportunity to get in there. Now, we've got 91 of those came to work for aerospace this summer. And so I'm going to be meeting with all of our interns. We have 270 interns this year. I'm going to be meeting with all the interns, and I'm going to be talking to them about how to start a successful career. 10 tips for early career success. It's something I've been doing for a long time. Been to a couple of universities recently, talking to the AIAA chapters and just trying to spread the wealth, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
WashingtonExec has been a great platform for helping to get that mentoring and to get out with all of the students. And I really appreciate all the work that JD has done on that.
Awesome. Yeah, I know when we started planning for this conversation, something that you felt very strongly about was that this conversation isn't about you, it's about bringing opportunities to the next generation of diverse talent. So thank you for those plugs, and we'll be sure to include some links in the blurb when we publish this episode for those who are interested.
Yeah, this really is about, I'm truly hoping that very few of the people that know me are actually listening to this. I'm really hoping their kids are.
Well, you have a really cool story, so I think they should be too.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it's inspiring, it's smart. There are so many ways to do things and to get things done, and you can work around the obstacles in your life to get there. And you are an example of that. And thank you so much for sharing your story with us and for inspiring the next generation of hopefully diverse STEM talent in our industry. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate the opportunity to connect with the next generation.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Humble Beginnings. Check out WashingtonExec.com to find more of our podcasts and profiles on executives. See you next time.